morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Sophie Schroeder, and I'm dialing in from Auckland in New Zealand, where I'm part of a team within Greenpeace called Roots, and we've been working to combat the growing global threat of disinformation. Today, we're collaborating with an amazing panel of experts in the field to bring you a discussion about disinformation through the lens of the climate crisis. But just before we get into it, I wanted to say that this is going to be the first in a series of discussions that we're running about disinformation. And throughout this series, we will look at different aspects of it. So we'll look at things like the role of journalism and social media in tackling it, victims and survivors of disinformation, and of course, strategies that we can all implement to counteract it in our day-to-day lives. But for today's discussion, we're going to focus specifically on the role that disinformation plays in the climate crisis. So we've probably all come across climate disinformation at some point, and we've heard the word disinformation a lot over the past few years. We've heard the basic, the world is warming naturally rhetoric, and then there are other muddier narratives that are kind of a bit harder to identify as disinformation around things like renewable energy and the causes of natural disasters. But I guess the key question is, where are these narratives coming from and what can we do about them? So to help us explore these questions and more, I would like to introduce our excellent panel. So we have Kate Sell, the Senior Climate Campaign Manager for Union of Concerned Scientists. We have Maya Rosner, a campaigner at Global Witness, who has a focus on digital threats to democracy. And we have Chris Cooper, Senior Campaign Director and Head of Office in Australia at Purpose Asia Pacific. I just wanted to say a huge thanks to all of you for being here today. I'm really excited for this discussion that we're going to be having over the next hour or so and all of the valuable insights that you'll be bringing. So I thought it would be good to just start off with some really quick introductions. Kind of introducing yourselves and what your hopes are for this roundtable today. So I thought first I would give the floor to Kate, and then if you could pass over to someone else, that would be great.
Good morning for me. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. As Sophie said, my name is Kate, and I am a Senior Climate Campaign Manager at the Union of Concerned Scientists. For those of you who aren't familiar with UCS, we are over 50 years old and have been working at the intersection of science and public policy for that time on a range of issues, including climate change. And so I'm really looking forward to talking to my colleagues, Mai and Chris. And I am calling in today from Massachusetts, where it is cool and cloudy, and I'm looking forward very much to this discussion. Go ahead, Mai.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thank you so much for the intro, Sophie. My name is Mai. I am usually based in London, but today I'm dialing in from the south of France, where it is very sunny. Sorry, Kate. I focus on digital threats to democracy at Global Witness, which is an organization that investigates and exposes human environmental abuses and campaigns for reform. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion today and to learning from Chris and Sophie and from Kate and from you all.
Thanks very much for having me. So my name's Chris, and I'm usually based in Sydney, and I work at Purpose, which is a advocacy and social impact agency. And we do all sorts of work around disinformation. And I'm really excited to learn from you all and to really talk about the need for collaboration around tackling climate disinfo. So looking forward to it.
Cool, thank you all so much. So to kick things off, before we get kind of really deep into the weeds of it, I thought that I would just throw some kind of very general first questions out to the floor, and whoever feels like kind of taking one and answering it, just shout or put your hand up. But I thought it would be useful to start off with, it's a very basic first question, but I think it frames the context of this discussion. And it is, what exactly is disinformation? You know, how is disinformation different from misinformation, and how do we know that something is disinformation? Kate.
It's such a good question and a great place to start. When I think about it, I think misinformation is an honest mistake. Disinformation is neither. It is not dishonest, and it's on purpose. Okay, those are the chief differences. Another difference is that misinformation tends to be one person's error. Disinformation tends to be a coordinated effort. So those are sort of some of the fundamental differences between the two. I think disinformation is part of a larger campaign to block progress on something. It's a one form of propaganda. Anyone else want to jump in?
I mean, that's pretty good, Kate. The only thing I would add to it is that intent behind disinformation, as distinct from misinformation, is also really important in terms of the tactics that's used. This isn't just about a bad piece of information. It's also about the way that it's pushed and spread and amplified. And that kind of comes to Kate's point about the coordination. I think that's a really important dimension of it as well.
Cool. Thank you both. And that actually kind of leads to the second more general question that I had, which is, I mean, why is disinformation dangerous? We've all seen narratives swirling around social media, but what is the real world impact that these kind of coordinated networks of disinformation actors actually have?
I'll jump in here. I mean, we've seen that, you know, these narratives don't stay online. They spill over into kind of our political lives. They enter the halls of power to the extent of, you know, leading to events like January 6th, attack on the Capitol. But when you're bringing it back specifically to climate disinformation, research shows that, you know, climate disinfo is one of the primary contributors to public polarization over the climate crisis. Also that individuals who are exposed to climate disinformation are less supportive of climate action and climate policies. And so the danger really is this erosion of urgency, the erosion of kind of a common sense of urgency and importance over the climate crisis. And that leads to inactivism and all kinds of kind of delayism at a really critical juncture in the fight against climate breakdown. So I would say that, you know, that's one very real consequence of these widespreading narratives.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I was really struck when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its most recent assessment report and specifically called out misinformation. I'm going to talk about why they might have called it misinformation in a minute, but called out misinformation as one of the major barriers to action. Was in the summary for policymakers. It might have been a little hard to get disinformation in there because it does ascribe intent, as Chris was saying, and that can be a tricky thing for a politically intended document to navigate. But it's clear to the world's scientists as gathered in that report that the efforts to sow confusion have actually damped down, as Maya was saying, our sense of urgency and our need for coordinated and effective action.
Yeah, I think one good example where that demonstrates both the relationship between misinformation and disinformation is in the 2019-2020 Australian summer, we had the worst bushfires that we've ever seen, truly horrific. And thanks to some very irresponsible reporting from journalists. There was articles about arsonists having started some of the fires. And that wasn't untrue in itself. There were some arsonists involved, but obviously, if you read the whole story, it spoke about how minimal that was, and that, you know, these bushfires were at a severity because of climate change. But that narrative around arsonists was picked up and then became the fuel for a broader coordinated disinformation campaign that saw multiple organizations, the use of bot networks and whatnot to push that narrative. And it led to effectively different segments of the Australian population experiencing two different versions of the story around those bushfires. One was a arsonist dominated one, and the other one was, this is climate change and it's happening. And so we always talk about the need for people to see the impacts of climate change, to truly understand it and be mobilized as much as we need to. And this was directly diminishing that, because there was a huge chunk of the population that weren't seeing that and were then fundamentally disagreeing with their fellow citizens who were all experiencing the same thing. So it has long running implications and harm, but I think that's a good example.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting, because one of the things I believe is that we're seeing more and more deliberate disinformation about climate change as the climate impacts become ever more obvious. And it is a clear attempt to persuade people not to believe their own eyes, their own experiences, their own, lived experience of walking outside and feeling the extreme heat, or smelling the wildfire smoke, or seeing the sea level rise and flooding on a perfectly sunny day. It's an attempt to ask us, who you're going to believe, the fossil fuel companies or your own lying eyes. And it's surprisingly effective.
Cool. Thank you so much all for those answers. I think that they framed the topic really well. I mean, with this information, we've established that there is a coordinated network of actors behind this, and that there are real world impacts to it. My next question was going to be, I guess, what is the goal of these networks? What do they have to gain? And I think, Kate, you've answered it somewhat there. Outside of creating polarization and confusion, is there anything else that these networks seek to gain in terms of, for example, policy or financial reasons?
Yeah, I mean, for decades in the United States, we've seen these coordinated efforts come from, networks of for-profit think tanks. I maybe shouldn't name names. I don't know if I'm going to get a legal check on here, but yeah, groups like the Heartland Institute and Koch brothers related networks have industry kind of motives around not wanting to see change in this area. But something that I'm kind of increasingly concerned about is the politicization of the climate conversation and efforts to drag it into kind of culture war narratives. So this has already existed, like I said, in the US for a much longer time, but I'm seeing it really spreading in the Anglosphere, definitely in the United Kingdom and certainly in Australia. I know Chris can speak more to this, but of trying to make climate kind of the next frontier of the culture war. So that it's not about kind of saving our planet, that it's about identity and freedom and control and, metropolitan elites telling you what you can and can't do. And some of the new actors that have entered this space based on this kind of hyper politicization, I think are just opportunists, and unlike the kind of more fossil fuel funded interests are just exploiting this as a way to kind of divide and conquer, to kind of gain political influence and clout. And so there's also that vein of kind of motivation.
Yeah, I agree again with and I would add that it seems to me that in this country, at least in the United States, that there's a coalition of actors that have several goals in mind and are working on multiple fronts. And climate change is one, and our democracy is another. Our public health is a third, and we've seen sort of a coalition over a coordination over the last few years and increasing overlap, so that the same people are spreading disinformation about voting and elections and climate change and COVID and it seems to me that when you have a problem like climate change, which is a complex problem that requires a coordinated, effective, global effort, one of the ways to block action is to destabilize the democracies who would take it. And so when you think about all of these things working together, destabilizing democracies so that they're less able to govern effectively, less able to act in concert with other governments, that's another means of blocking progress on climate change and many, many other things as well.
Thank you all so much for your really well-rounded answers on those. It was really interesting, and it leads quite well into the kind of next part of our discussion, which is I'll be taking a little bit of a deeper dive and asking you questions that are specific to you and the work that you're doing. And I thought that I would start off with you, Kate, and the question that I have, and it kind of leads on a little bit from what you were just saying before. I know that the team that you lead at Union for Concerned Scientists works to create policy change that will reduce global emissions. So in your context, and I guess over the past couple of years, just how much of a growing concern and impact is climate disinformation having on being able to push for progressive policy change in the work that you do?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that we see disinformation spike or peak when we're closer to something actually working on a policy moment in this country. There was, for example, in the early to mid 2000s, pretty strong understanding across the public that climate change was real, that it was happening, that it was here and now with us, that it was human caused, that scientists agreed about these things, and that it was bad for our health and our well-being and our livelihoods. And when we were at the point of seeing progress on climate change in the US legislatures, the federal legislature, that's when we saw a major disinformation push. And similarly now, I think we have, a very fragile majority of actors who would prefer climate action, and we have an administration that is committed to it, and we are seeing another spike. And so I think it's very relevant because it comes right at the point where you need to keep the pressure from the public on, you need to keep that demand high, and it works to dampen that. Is that responsive to your question, Sophie?
That was excellent. Thank you so much. And it leads somewhat into my next question for Mai, which is, there was a recent report from Global Witness, which was a great report that demonstrated that Facebook algorithms actually pushing people deeper into the world of climate disinformation. They're pushing them towards climate disinformation. So what's happening here? How does this work, and what can we do about it? And what does it look like in terms of policy in the world around us?
Yeah, so we noticed in our monitoring of climate discourses online that people were living in very separate worlds. So we wanted to kind of test what the experience of a climate skeptic user might be online, and we decided to investigate that on Facebook. And so I created an online persona of this woman named Jane, and Jane expressed an interest in climate skeptic content. And as you mentioned, Facebook's recommendation algorithm, then directed her to more and more climate disinformation. And often it was increasingly extreme in nature. So what began on pages that had what we call like distract and delay tactics, which, don't kind of question the existence of climate change, but kind of undermine it in other ways by saying things like, renewables are unreliable, and the implications of climate change are overstated. Ended up developing through her journey online into kind of outright climate denial and conspiracy content. And so the reason for this, it fundamentally comes back to Facebook's business model, this surveillance for profit model, whereby, Facebook makes about 97% of its revenues but through advertisement. And the way they do this is they, collect lots of data on their users. So about your behaviors, your interests, your preferences, and they use that to sell targeted advertising that can be predictive, right? It's targeted right to your profile. But the consequence of this is that they also, in order to make more money, optimize for engagement. So they want to keep you on the platform as long as possible to show you as many ads. And so it's not just the ads that end up being targeted towards your profile, it's also the information. And this has it has many effects, but two of them. One is the filter bubble effect, which is basically the principle that people would rather consume content that affirms their existing worldview. And so if I'm someone who is climate skeptic, I would want to see more content like that rather than something that challenges my worldview. And so that pushes people into these kind of echo chambers. And then the other effect is this radicalizing effect, sometimes called like the rabbit hole, which is in order to keep you scrolling, liking, sharing, that optimizing for engagement. The content that travels the farthest, the fastest, is content that elicits this emotional reaction that's outrageous or sensational, or that increases in kind of its extremity. And so those are effects of the fundamental systems that underpin these algorithms. And so I think the primary issue here is people think of the way we consume information as neutral, but these systems, the architecture isn't neutral. And in terms of how we address that, there's a lot of regulation that needs to come in around transparency and auditing and risk assessments. And so far, the European Union has gone the furthest in doing that through their recent legislation, the Digital Services Act. But other jurisdictions, primarily the United States, really need to take note and follow suit, because these issues are still very, very prevalent.
I'll just add to that. I think the work that Maya and Global Witness are doing is really excellent. And I think something that we've seen as well that is the sort of flip side of that, because I think that organic sort of rabbit holing done by the platform, by the algorithms of the platforms is a huge factor. And then when it comes to the sort of weaponization of those platforms, being that you have, and really anyone with a credit card has access to very intimate data profiles about you to understand what your vices and vulnerabilities are, it means that this becomes a pay-for-play system. I mean, even most not-for-profit organizations need to pay to reach their own members and supporters with their own content. And so we've got a system a platform that leans towards prioritizing the sensational, the conspiratorial, the emotional, because we're human and that's more engaging. But then you've also got the weaponization of it, which is tilted towards those with the most resources. And so for the climate movement, and before I was at Purpose, I ran digital campaigns. In the climate movement, I saw that it was that this is an entire system that's stacked against us and is stacked in favor of those with who are willing to push the most sensational and outrageous content and have the money to do so.
Thank you very much for those insights, and that's quite a good segue as well into Chris and your work, the work that you're doing with Purpose Asia Pacific. So I know that recently you've been working with a group of organizations on the issue of climate disinformation in Australia. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that work and some of the insights that you've gained from that.
Yeah, we'd love to. So we've been working on monitoring and analyzing and tracking climate disinformation in different ways, in different parts of the world, but in Australia specifically. And last year, we were part of a global coalition of organizations that were working to monitor and track climate disinformation around COP. And then we subsequently did another Australian-focused project, which all of this has been sort of iterating a model for how to do this work. And it's acknowledging that there's a number of organizations that do really incredible work in the monitoring and analysis side of things, but the translation of those insights into actionable campaigns and actionable sort of interventions is still a challenge that I think hasn't really been nailed yet. And so our work this year worked with about a dozen organizations here to do some specific monitoring and analysis, but then to really put some work into thinking about how do we take those insights and how do we pair those insights with the knowledge and experience of that network of partners who know both the nuance of the issues much better, but also have live campaigns to then look at, okay, how do we now co-create rapidly off those insights in order to design campaigns or to bring those insights into the existing campaigns to improve them and bolster them. And I think what we've learned, not only through this project, but also that global project and others, is that the need for collaboration is really important. The need to share knowledge and insights and frameworks and tools is really important, because the tools can be expensive, but also most climate organizations, in my experience, don't have the analyst capability to do a lot of this work. And so how do we bring the best of those sort of worlds together into a model that can enable that co-creation of interventions? And one of the tools that I think became really useful in that project is a disinformation threat matrix, which we were given by our friends in the US, GQR, who developed, as far as I know, the first one. And what the matrix is this tool that you can use to bring a bit of the subjectivity out of the assessment of a piece of disinformation and think about what is the potential impact and harm of this and what is the potential reach, and then use that matrix to inform what kind of response is the appropriate strategic response. And so those responses range from, report it to authorities because it's a direct call to violence, or someone's potentially in harm's way because of this disinformation, all the way through to do nothing, which is a really important part as well, because it also helps to inform that often our instinct is to respond to disinformation. And that might be not only in terms of, you might want to duke it out in the comment section of a Facebook post, or you, as an organization, you might want to put out a media release to say, hey, that's not true. And helping to bring that awareness up that sometimes that actually does a lot of harm. Certainly, you'll never win the fight in the Facebook comment section, right? That's not the playing field on which you want to have those debates. But also thinking about the audiences that are being targeted with this information, and whether your organization actually has the legitimacy and is a trusted voice with that audience. And so sometimes if a climate organization puts out a statement to say, hey, this narrative is trending, or it was in the Murdoch media, or whatever it might have been, and you calling it out as false with evidence and data can often just lend more credibility to those who don't trust you because they are coming from a space of distrusting elites or whatever the value base is that they're kind of operating on. And so bringing these tools into the project to help inform better responses, and then looking at where do we need a new campaign, a new intervention that we need to spin up, where can we plug it in, how do we inoculate audiences, how do we disrupt those disinformation actors. And this is sort of an ongoing piece of work to work out what the best ways are, but we've been testing out different interventions essentially to see what's worked, where you can report to some authorities, and it's different in each country, obviously, whether you have a electoral commission or a charities commission or a consumer watchdog that might have some sort of remit. And we've learned a lot about what can work and certainly what doesn't work, which is sometimes even more useful.
I really appreciate what Chris just said about the risk of arguing or trying to debunk. This has been a really hard lesson for many Union of Concerned Scientists staff and supporters to learn, because science is about debunking, right? The scientific method is to come up with an idea and see if you can prove it false. That's debunking. And it's absolutely fatally flawed as a method for dealing with disinformation. And what Chris said about recognizing the narrative, thinking about the values, thinking about who's trusted, and whether it's you, is really important. And I would also offer just taking a step back and thinking about what we call the disinformation playbook, which is very often used on issues about tobacco, used on climate issues, used on COVID issues. Whenever there's a science and policy and well-being nexus, this is the thing that corporate interests and policymakers who support corporate interests tend to roll out. And if you Google Union of Concerned Scientists disinformation playbook, you will see what we're talking about. And that thing, I think it's 5 years old, but while the rate of churn and the increased creation of disinfo content that it has sped up, but the playbook is the same.
Thank you, Kate. And I might actually come to you again. So much of the work that you do focuses on alleviating the burdens that climate change poses to environmental justice communities, so low-income communities, communities of colour. I was curious to know, does climate disinformation also disproportionately affect some of these communities? And if it does, what is the impact of that, and what can we do about it?
Well, it certainly can. And I actually haven't checked in on polling for a while, but there's a couple of things at play here. And one is that in the United States, the polling shows that the people who are most in favor of climate action are people of color. They're Black, Indigenous, Latino, and other peoples of color. And so if what I said earlier is true, that you want to target where the urgency for action is strongest, then you would expect disinformation to circulate and to be targeted at communities that most want to act and are most at risk. And there's been a history of various kinds of racist and unjust policies in this country that have put people of color in harm's way. And so anything that undermines their understanding of climate change and the risks it poses and how it interacts with other environmental risks puts them in even greater danger. And so it's a peculiarly cynical and, to my view, I'm just going to say despicable way of behaving. And in terms of what we do, I think that there are real leaders in the environmental justice and climate justice space who are much better positioned, again, because of what Chris just talked about, of trusted messengers and the importance of that. There are people who are certainly much more qualified and able to deal with that effectively than, say, I might be.
And in line with issues of social justice, Global Witness challenges abuse of power to protect human rights. So how is climate disinformation and wider social justice issues like human rights, how are those two connected?
That's a really good question. And there's a whole host of ways that they're connected, but I think one really illustrative example that I'll zero in on is to do with environmental defenders. So Global Witness has a whole portion of our work dedicated to land and environmental defenders, Indigenous activists around the world who are at threat of being killed and attacked by illiberal governments and corrupt corporations. And so one thing that came out of a climate disinformation monitoring effort that we were a part of during COP26 was a really targeted disinformation campaign against a Brazilian Indigenous youth activist called Sai Suri. She flew to Glasgow to give a speech in which she condemned Bolsonaro for his continued attacks on Indigenous people and the policies, his climate wrecking policies that are destroying the Amazon. And shortly after she gave that talk, we started seeing this big spike in kind of online disinformation campaigns against her that very quickly spiraled into actual false imagery, saying that she was a paid, actress, that she wasn't actually Indigenous, that, and then calling into question, her morality and shaming her. And so this is an example of how climate disinformation can be weaponized to really have a chilling effect on climate activism, to silence people, to prevent them from speaking out. It presents a really serious threat to their security and safety. And so that's just one way that climate disinformation can really impact social justice movements and touch, kind of have this chilling effect on their ability to continue, pushing for change.
Thank you, Mai. And I guess when we're talking about the impacts of climate disinformation on communities around the world, I had a question for you, Chris. I mean, you're obviously based in Australia, but is the way that climate disinformation functions, say in Australia, different to other parts of the world? Or are we seeing some of these really damaging, problematic narratives that threaten, that raise issues of social justice and climate justice, making the leap from not only country to country, but also language to language?
Yeah, so of course there's local nuance and cultural elements that influence how disinformation manifests in each country. But I mean, largely we do see the same set of tactics and narratives. We see a lot of, we are a very US hungry culture. I don't know how else to put that. And so there's a lot of narratives that we've seen used in the US, a lot of tactics that we then see imported here. Not all of them work in the same way. And we've also seen in the most recent work we did was what looked to us very much like the testing of narratives that were proliferating in the UK being tried out here. And so I think it does change somewhat, but we are seeing this kind of coordinated more globally than anything else. And I think also there's the, like Australia plays an outsized role in terms of the amount of climate disinformation content that our traditional media and publishers produce, which is a sad state of affairs. But Sky News Australia is, and there's a few other sort of individuals who really show up all over the world in content that's used elsewhere. And I think that that's yeah, that's really important to take note of, because you're seeing the same content translated into a new language or a new cultural context. And so I think there's a lot of, yeah, and that's why I sort of a greater kind of collaboration and coordination between organizations on our side of this fight is really important, because we do see that. The other thing I was going to say, and Maya brought this up before around some of the trends that we do see globally, and that's one of, and I think really important for climate activists and campaigners who are on this session with us, is that it's often really less about climate. It is increasingly a conversation about freedom, about how else do I put it, like sovereignty, all of these other ideas that climate is becoming this sort of proxy, both for recruitment between climate denialist networks and far right groups and the freedom movement. I'm not sure if that's what it's called everywhere else, but the sort of anti-lockdown movement, where we've seen a lot of cross-pollination there as well. And when you sort of dig into those audiences a little bit more, it really isn't about the climate science, and it's often not about climate. It's about what kind of freedom do we have, this anti-elite, this distrust in experts and authority, which is particularly for diaspora groups and multicultural segments of the population, is not unfounded, right? There's a lot of reason for particularly people of color, particularly Indigenous Australians, to distrust the government. That is a sensible and a very reasonable position to take. But so when you're then seeing climate disinformation being wrapped up in those kind of issues, your ability to engage with those individuals and those segments of the community on the climate science is not going to be an effective way to sort of challenge that. And so I think the global trends are really important. And I think, you know, more knowledge sharing around what we're seeing and what we're learning about how to unpick some of that, to contextualize it to our own communities and countries is really important.
I just wanted to jump in quickly, and Chris made such a great point about this increase in kind of climate being wrapped up in conversations around identity politics and, you know, issues that politicians have scapegoated around for decades, like migration, these really hot button issues in the US, even, you know, critical race theory and LGBTQ plus kind of conversations, even, you know, everything is kind of being wrapped up in this broader culture war framing. And I just wanted to say that I think this is something really to watch out for in the times ahead, as we're seeing energy prices increase due to, you know, the war in Ukraine and you know, the kind of various sanctions regimes and unstable markets, and this kind of increase in energy, I think is going to be a real exploitable moment for, particularly in the UK, where class is one of the major dividing lines of kind of cultural, political space. I could really see, you know, these opportunists stepping into that space and blaming these, you know, increased prices on renewables, for example. And so I think that's really a space to watch, that real whipping up of political and emotional sentiment around climate. You know, if energy prices are higher and people are hurting from their increased bills, that's going to be a very exploitable frontier in the coming months.
Thank you all so much for your insights. So many useful takeaways, and even, you know, just the very beginning of a much more in-depth discussion coming through, that will hopefully be useful for our audience in terms of being able to explore this issue, you know, a bit deeper in their own time. What I thought I'd do now is, now that we've all had the chance to kind of listen a bit more about what each other does and the work, I thought I'd change things up a bit and kind of throw this roundtable over to all of you, Chris, Kate, and Mai. And if you had any burning questions that you wanted to ask someone else in this discussion based on what you've heard, then go ahead and do it. I thought I'll throw it to Kate first, but after that, feel free anyone to just jump in and ask away.
Thanks, Sophie. One thing I was wondering is if we've talked a lot about problems, and we've heard a little bit about, approaches, right? And Chris, for example, talking very clearly and passionately, I think, about the need for effective coordination and knowledge sharing and strategizing together. But what other kinds of, for those of us who are being blocked in our goals for progress by disinformation, what other kinds of solutions would you like to see us employ? And anyone who wants to go, Maya, you want to go?
Sure. I mean, I'm coming at this from a perspective of kind of big tech regulation. And so I think that on that front, I can offer some insight in terms of what I'd like to see happen. We have these companies, some of the most powerful and rich companies that the world has ever seen, that have gone virtually unregulated for, years now, that have not invested in the kind of, responsibility that you need to steward platforms that have billions of users worldwide and that are created some really adverse impacts as a consequence. And so I think it's well beyond time that we have some kind of serious regulation of these platforms. And I think one of those has to be transparency. There's so much opacity around how these systems work, what goes on within, the decisions that are made. It's thanks to, researchers and whistleblowers that we even have information about how these how we consume information is shaping our behaviors and shaping, the health of our democracies and public discourse. So we need transparency requirements around data sharing, around auditing of these algorithms and how they're ranking information, how they're distributing information to different users, how they're, weaponizing our data against us. We also need risk assessments in terms of what every platform should have to conduct risk assessments about what their product, how it poses a risk to fundamental rights. And I would include climate, the right to, it's a health and safety, it's a public health concern as well. So risk assessments, audits, data sharing, just far more oversight and regulation. And also, much more investment on behalf of these companies in safe user safety. So, the English version of most of these platforms is the best version that exists, right? Because almost all of their resources that are sunk into content moderation are done so in English language. So, in other countries, there's just not even a sliver of that. There's barely no moderation going on. And while I do think that this is a systemic problem, that the architecture is really what needs to be regulated, there is also, far more resources that the companies themselves have to sink into. If you want to operate with billions of users worldwide, you also need to put in the requisite, resources to keep those people safe. So those are some of the changes I'd like to see.
Yeah, I come at this from a tech regulation perspective often as well, and I think the role of the social media platforms is significant, and we should hold them to account in all the ways that Maya's spoken about. I think the other part for me is that I've seen the way that our climate movement in the West is usually too white, and the impact of both climate change, but also disinformation tends to impact communities of color more. And I think when you look at the way that the climate movement has made strides in recent years, it's usually because it's been more diverse and with more diverse leadership that's genuine and authentic. I also think in terms of tech regulation, the best or the most powerful movement that I've seen is in the US and coming from the racial justice space and talking about racialized tech and racialized use of data. And that I think is really powerful. And I think that if we're going to make progress on this, acknowledging the racialized component of this problem is going to be really important. And that means, for those of us white folk to really think about where our role as an ally and support is to let these movements be led by the most impacted. And I think increasingly we're seeing that is not only the right way to do things, but also the most effective. And that's, it's tricky for some organizations, but it's the work to do that. And so I think both on terms of like tackling disinformation and thinking about that through an equity lens, as well as the tech regulation piece, both of those spaces really need that. And that needs to be a focus as well.
I have a question for Chris. I hope this doesn't put you on the spot, but I'm just really curious about the Australian context given your recent election. And also, I think you made mention of your traditional media and the kind of, hyper concentration that exists in Australia. So I just was wondering, like, this outcome in the recent election, how you think of it, how did the climate piece fit into it, and how do you think about all of that?
Yeah, good question. I think I think it's important also to not think that Facebook is the beginning and the end of this problem. Conservative media, the Murdoch press, for us, we have like more than 3/4 of our traditional media is owned by Murdoch. That's obviously not good. And their role in fueling and providing the kind of content, which then is either outright disinformation in the first place, or is then distorted and used by disinfo actors to push more disinformation, is real. And so this is an ecosystem problem, and we need to think about that as well. And the Australian election was incredible. It was a wholesale rejection of this government. And there's lots of interesting dynamics to it about how it plays out. But I think that in terms of disinformation, when you've got a movement, and we were tracking disinformation of all forms and hate speech through the election, seeing that same network essentially of fossil fuel companies, political operatives, individuals, community groups, pushing this kind of pushing disinformation. They've essentially had their main lever of power being that they've had a conservative government and an increasingly conservative government in power for 10 years. They now don't have that lever of power. And they've just been, it's not really that it's not like it was a close election, it was a complete rejection of that side of politics for a bunch of reasons. But what they have now as their main lever of influence and power is disinformation, and it is these platforms, their ability to lean into the culture wars, I think is going to be the flavor of politics for the next little while in Australia, because that's where it's what they've got left to work on. They don't have a mandate. Their policy mandate is completely rejected, but they have access to AstroTurf groups. They have a lot of money, and they can throw it at disinformation to undermine the progress that's about to be made by a new government that's reasonably progressive, with a bunch of new independents in the mix as well, who all campaigned on climate action. Their goal is going to be undermining that, and this is really their one way of doing that. So I think in some ways the election, as great as the turnout was, has just made climate disinformation a lot worse.
I didn't realize 3/4 of the media was owned by Murdoch. That is a wild statistic.
Yeah, I think it's 70% is the number that's thrown around, but I think it's also been made worse by the dominance of the digital platforms as well, which has seen the closure of local publications, as we've seen all over the world, certainly in Europe, definitely in the US as well, where you now have these news deserts that don't have local news, or if they do, it's owned by Murdoch. And all of those publishers and media outlets are trying to compete for eyeballs still against a machine that they can't possibly compete with. And so even if you push through, controversial legislation like the News Media Bargaining Code here, which sought to see the platforms pay publishers, I mean, most of that went to Murdoch Media at the end of the day. And I don't think it went to paying for more local journalists. I think it probably went elsewhere. So it's a huge problem. And this is, again, that ecosystem problem. It's a sort of information crisis on all forms. And there's lots of different players, but focusing on, I think, the big tech platforms and connecting in with communities that aren't us, that are outside of our bubble, and working out ways to work with those communities is where we need to focus, because that's, I think, where the battle will be fought.
Well, I would love to be able to continue this discussion for a lot more time, because it's so important, but sadly we are coming to the end of it. And I guess we've spent the past hour discussing disinformation and the intersection that it has with the climate crisis. And so I was wanting to get some final thoughts from all of you on one concrete thing that people who are listening can do to combat climate disinformation in their day-to-day lives. And if you can say it in just 1 or 2 sentences, I challenge you to do that, then that would be amazing. Whoever wants to go first, feel free to go for it.
I would say if you see it online, report it to the platform. It's a little bit of a hypothesis. We'll see if it works, but report it under the category of undermining health. Climate change is terrible for public health, and this is a case that we're trying to make to to social media companies, is that they need to regulate climate disinformation as they have COVID disinformation. Thanks.
I would say this is a bit, we've talked about this ecosystem, right? Disinformation on tech platforms, disinformation in traditional media. But I think another component is like the enormous amount of climate disinfo in advertising. It's like a real cutting edge greenwashing, and that happens on a massive scale. And I think as individuals, we actually have quite a lot of power as consumers. So when you see your favorite brand or your favorite football team, promote any scheme that is climate disinfo or is actually increasing emissions or is just like a form of greenwashing, call them out and tell them that you don't want any of that or don't spend your money there, but tell them.
Yeah, I think both of those answers are pretty solid. And I just reiterate, collaboration. Like, our opponents are well-resourced, very sophisticated, and also better at collaborating than the left and the progressive movement generally is, right? We like to eat each other, and we've seen where, white supremacist groups are working with evangelical groups and other kind of, conservative or religious groups, and they are happy to put aside their differences to achieve their shared goals. And I think if we're not able to do that, we'll never make progress.
Thank you all for those really great final tips. And just a huge thanks for taking the time today to come and talk about this really important topic with us. It's been really great sitting back and listening to everything that you've covered. So I just wanted to say a huge thanks to our panel, Kate Sell, the Union of Concerned Scientists, Maya Rosner from Global Witness, and Chris Cooper from Purpose. If you would like to learn more about the work of this panel, then be sure to follow their organizations, which should be tagged in the description of this video today. And if you're inspired to take action yourself, then you're in luck, because Greenpeace and Global Campaigning Community Avaaz are going to be running an online training on how to identify, map, track, and tackle climate disinformation. And that's going to be kicking off on June 27th. And that's going to be open to anyone, but numbers will be limited. So you can register for that in the description of this video as well. Thank you again to our panel, and thank you so much for everyone who tuned in to listen to this discussion today. My name is Sophie Schroeder. I'm here on behalf of the Roots team at Greenpeace. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having us.